Harold Schonberg adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the gathering from his corner position in the elegant Upper East Side apartment. At 51, he commanded respect as the New York Times chief music critic, a position that carried cultural authority across America. His reviews could elevate unknown composers or consign established artists to obscurity. Classical music was his realm. Real music. Music that demanded education, discipline, and above all, sophisticated restraint that separated art from entertainment. The apartment belonged to Margaret Whitmore, a steel heiress who hosted monthly salons, bringing together New York's artistic elite. The penthouse overlooks Central Park, its walls lined with original Picassos, its grand piano a pristine Steinway played by Horowitz himself. Tonight's gathering drew 45 carefully curated guests, composers, conductors, jazz musicians Schonberg grudgingly respected, serious writers, and younger faces representing whatever passed for the cultural avant-garde. Schonberg had arrived expecting civilized discourse about Bernstein's latest conducting or debate over whether Stockhausen represented progress or pretentious noisemaking. Instead, to his growing irritation, the conversation kept circling back to someone called Jimi Hendrix. Rock music. That's what these otherwise intelligent people were discussing with unwarranted seriousness, as if three-chord noise deserved the same consideration as Brahms or Bach. Schonberg listened with mounting displeasure as educated adults praised this Hendrix character for supposed innovation and revolutionary approach to the instrument. Revolutionary. The word made Schonberg's jaw tighten. There was nothing revolutionary about turning amplifiers to maximum volume and assaulting audiences with undisciplined noise. Revolution in music required intellectual rigor, theoretical advancement, sophisticated understanding of harmonic progression, not theatrical displays of primitive rhythm. Emotional expression requires restraint, Schonberg finally interjected, his voice cutting through the chatter. Volume is not artistry. Any amateur can turn an amplifier up. The relevant question is whether there exists anything worth amplifying in the first place. The room quieted immediately. Everyone knew who Harold Schonberg was, understood the weight his opinions carried. Several distinguished heads nodded in agreement. A young woman near the Steinway challenged him directly. "Have you actually heard Hendrix perform live, Mr. Schonberg?" "I don't need to subject myself to noise in order to recognize it as noise," Schonberg replied with patient condescension. "Loud music is a confession of artistic bankruptcy. It admits the musician possesses nothing sufficiently interesting to command attention at normal volume, so they compensate with decibels. True artistry speaks in whispers and holds attention through substance rather than spectacle." The young woman looked as if she might argue further, but Schonberg's authority silenced her protest. Someone mentioned that Hendrix was performing downtown tonight. The conversation moved on, but Schonberg felt satisfied. He'd made his point. Volume was the enemy of nuance, amplification the refuge of the untalented. 25 minutes later, the apartment door opened quietly. A tall black man with an enormous afro entered without fanfare, carrying a worn guitar case. He moved through the room with surprising grace, wearing clothes that suggested artistic sensibility rather than commercial calculation. He found a spot near the windows overlooking Central Park where he could observe without necessarily participating. Schonberg didn't immediately realize who the newcomer was. He continued holding court, explaining why classical music remained supreme. The great composers understood that every dynamic marking carries precise meaning. He lectured, "Piano doesn't simply mean soft, it means exactly the right kind of softness for that specific moment. These rock musicians think loud and louder constitute a complete emotional palette." "Harold," interrupted Margaret Whitmore, approaching with nervous energy, "I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Jimi Hendrix." The conversation stopped dead. Schonberg looked across the room at the quiet figure by the windows. This was the musician causing all the fuss? He appeared almost scholarly, certainly not like someone who made his living creating sonic assault. "Mr. Hendrix," Schonberg said with polite formality, "I was just explaining why volume cannot substitute for genuine musical sophistication." Jimmy nodded slowly, considering this statement seriously. "I understand your point," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly soft and thoughtful. You believe that loud music means the musician doesn't have anything worth saying at normal volume. Precisely. Schonberg felt satisfied at being understood by his opposition. True musical expression doesn't require amplification to achieve its effect. If the music contains genuine substance, it commands attention at any dynamic level. Jimmy stood and opened his guitar case, revealing a beautiful acoustic instrument, its wood worn smooth by years of playing. Would you mind if I tested that theory? The room's energy shifted perceptibly. People sensed something significant about to happen. Schonberg gestured toward an empty chair. By all means, I'm curious to see how you approach music without electronic amplification. Jimmy walked to the chair with unhurried confidence, sat down with the acoustic guitar positioned across his lap, and spent several moments tuning by ear. His fingers worked with absolute precision, adjusting each string until it reached exactly the right tension. The room watched in complete, expectant silence. Then Jimmy began playing. The first notes emerged so softly they seemed to materialize from the guitar itself rather than from his fingers. Not just quiet, but whisper quiet, barely above silence. Yet somehow every person heard every note with crystalline clarity. The melody was deceptively simple, haunting, built on a minor chord progression that felt simultaneously ancient and immediate. His fingers moved across strings with surgical precision, each note placed exactly where needed. This wasn't tentative quietness from someone lacking confidence. This was supremely confident quietness from someone who understood that silence made each note more precious. Schonberg stopped breathing. He'd heard acoustic guitar before countless times. Classical guitar by Segovia at Carnegie Hall, flamenco by authentic Spanish masters in intimate venues, serious folk practitioners in academic settings. He'd analyzed countless performances, written hundreds of reviews, developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding musical excellence. But this was fundamentally different from anything in his experience. Jimmy wasn't just playing quietly to prove a point or win an argument. He was using quietness as a sophisticated musical element itself, treating silence as carefully as sound, making the spaces between notes carry as much precise emotional weight as the notes themselves. Something was happening to Schonberg's understanding of music in real time. His carefully constructed critical framework, built over decades of professional experience, was being gently dismantled by each whispered note. The theoretical distinctions he'd relied upon, between serious and popular music, between educated and intuitive musicianship, between sophisticated restraint and primitive emotion, were dissolving as he listened. The melody evolved organically, never getting louder, but somehow achieving greater intensity through subtlety rather than force. Jimmy's thumb worked bass strings, while his fingers found intricate harmonies above, creating what sounded like a complete orchestral arrangement, using only 10 fingers and 6 strings. Everything remained at that whisper level that demanded absolute attention. Schonberg realized with growing amazement that he was witnessing a complete musical statement being made at the threshold of audibility. Every person had unconsciously leaned forward, straining to catch each subtle note, hanging on every microscopic bend, every slight rhythmic variation. The performance created the most intense listening experience Schonberg could remember. The song built emotional intensity without adding volume. Jimmy's fingers found tensions and releases that made whisper-quiet music more gripping than most orchestras at maximum volume. He was telling a story through pure sound, painting musical pictures with microscopic gestures, creating entire landscapes of emotion through the most minimal means imaginable. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. Each chord change felt like a revelation rather than a technical exercise. Around the room, faces had changed. Margaret Whitmore sat frozen in her chair, her usual social composure completely abandoned. A distinguished composer near the bar had closed his eyes, his head tilted slightly as if trying to catch frequencies that existed just beyond normal hearing. The young woman who'd challenged Schonberg earlier now had tears streaming down her face, though she seemed unaware of crying. Even the jazz musicians, who prided themselves on sophisticated listening skills, looked stunned by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a guitar performance. This was a masterclass in how music could transcend its own medium. Halfway through, Schonberg understood with shocking clarity that he was witnessing something that challenged everything he'd believed about musical dynamics. This wasn't just technically impressive, though the mastery was flawless. This wasn't just emotionally moving, though several people had tears in their eyes. This was proof that musical power had nothing to do with volume. As the performance continued, Schonberg found himself absorbed in details he'd never imagined possible. The way Jimi used natural harmonics to create bell-like overtones. The way single notes seemed to contain entire chords through careful finger positioning. This was music of genuine intellectual depth, combined with profound emotional expression. When Jimi finished, he allowed the last note to fade until it merged with natural silence. For several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but sacred, as if any sound would violate the intimate perfection they'd shared. Finally, someone began applauding. Then everyone was applauding, but even the applause was different, quieter, more reverent, as if the audience understood that normal response would violate the delicate intimacy they'd experienced. Jimi set the guitar down gently and looked at Schonberg. "Was that loud enough?" he asked, with the faintest suggestion of a smile. Schonberg couldn't respond immediately. He'd spent 3 decades building his reputation on analyzing musical experiences with authority, placing artistic achievement into proper perspective. But what he'd just heard defied every framework he'd developed. That was... Schonberg started, then stopped, struggling for adequate words. "That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." "Same notes I'd play loud," Jimi said simply, without triumph. "Just play them quiet instead. Music doesn't get better or worse because of volume. It just gets different." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Schonberg had experienced. Instead of defending positions, he found himself asking genuine questions. How did Jimi think about dynamics? What was his relationship to silence? How had he developed such control? Jimi answered thoughtfully, without ego. He talked about listening to spaces between notes, how quiet playing forced precision. "When you play loud," he explained, "you can hide behind volume. When you play quiet, every note has to justify itself." Schonberg left that evening profoundly shaken, not angry or defensive, but fundamentally challenged in ways he was still trying to process. He'd built his entire career on clear distinctions between serious music and popular entertainment, between educated artistry and intuitive expression, between music worthy of critical analysis and music that could be dismissed as commercial product. Those distinctions, which had seemed so obvious and necessary just hours earlier, suddenly seemed less meaningful, perhaps even arbitrary. Walking through Central Park toward his apartment, Schonberg found himself replaying the evening's events obsessively, the way Jimi had approached the guitar without any visible ego or desire to impress. The complete absence of showmanship in favor of pure musical communication. The technical mastery deployed not for its own sake, but in service of something deeper and more elusive. This challenged everything Schonberg thought he understood about the relationship between training and talent, between theory and intuition, between classical sophistication and popular accessibility. Over the following weeks, he found himself returning to that night, replaying Jimi's performance in memory. The technical skill had been impeccable, but more than that, the musical intelligence was undeniable. 3 months later, Schonberg did something unprecedented in his career. He attended a Jimi Hendrix concert at Madison Square Garden, purchasing his own ticket and sitting anonymously in the crowd, rather than accepting the press credentials that would have placed him in the privileged reviewer section. He wanted to experience this music as an ordinary audience member, without the protective distance of professional obligation. The volume was indeed loud, sometimes almost overwhelmingly so, exactly as he'd expected. But now he heard something completely different from what he'd anticipated. The loudness wasn't compensation for lack of substance or musical sophistication. It was another carefully chosen color on an expanded musical palette, another precisely calibrated way of expressing ideas that couldn't be communicated effectively through whispers alone. Another tool for creating specific kinds of emotional experiences that required power and intensity to achieve their full transformative impact. In his review, published in the New York Times the following day, Schonberg wrote something that shocked the music establishment. "Musical sophistication cannot be measured in decibels, either high or low. Last night, Jimi Hendrix demonstrated that volume and artistry are independent variables. His electric guitar work showed the same intelligence, precision, and emotional depth that characterizes the finest chamber music, only expressed through different means. We critics must abandon the prejudice that equates loudness with crudeness. Art finds its own level of expression. The review created enormous controversy. Classical purists accused Schonberg of losing his standards. Rock fans wondered whether they'd been insulted or complimented. But musicians understood immediately what Schonberg had recognized. Good music was good music, regardless of genre or volume. Years later, in a 1975 interview, Schonberg reflected honestly, "Hendrix taught me that my understanding of musical dynamics was incomplete. I'd thought of loud and soft as opposites, but he showed me they're different ways of saying the same thing. When someone can command absolute attention with whisper-quiet playing, you realize volume has nothing to do with authority." The interviewer asked whether he regretted his initial skepticism. "Not at all," Schonberg replied. "Being wrong about Hendrix was the most educational experience of my career. It forced me to question assumptions I didn't know I held. Good criticism requires willingness to have your mind changed by evidence." When Jimi died in 1970, Schonberg's obituary was personal and heartfelt. Jimi Hendrix proved that musical genius recognizes no boundaries of genre or volume. His death is a loss not just to rock music, but to music itself. He understood that a note's power depends not on how loud you play it, but on how much truth you put into it. The night Harold Schonberg met Jimi Hendrix changed more than one critic's opinion. It challenged the entire cultural establishment to reconsider how they define musical worth. Schonberg learned that authority comes not from volume, but from understanding. And understanding sometimes requires listening more carefully than you've ever listened before. Jimi didn't argue with the critic that night. He didn't defend his choices or justify his methods. He simply played 5 minutes of music so quietly and beautifully that it redefined what musical power could mean. In those whispered notes, he shattered 50 years of assumptions about noise, art, and the relationship between the two. Sometimes the most powerful statement is made most quietly,